Huey Erskine was a super good-looking guy, probably the most handsome man in all of London. He had curly brown hair, sharp gray eyes, and a face that could have been on the cover of a magazine. He wasn't just good-looking, though. He had loads of friends, too. But here's the problem. Huey didn't have much money. His dad had been an army officer, but now he was gone. All Huey had left from him was an old sword and a few books. Not exactly the kind of inheritance that sets you up for life. Huey had tried his hand at a few jobs over the years. He worked for a tea merchant for a while, selling tea. Then he tried working for a wine merchant, selling wine. But honestly, Huey just wasn't cut out for any of it. He wasn't bad, but he wasn't particularly good at anything either. Now, Huey was in love. He wanted to marry this amazing girl, Laura Merton. She was the daughter of an army officer, just like Huey's dad. And the good news? Laura was totally in love with him too. The bad news? Her dad, Colonel Merton, wasn't having it. "You're a great guy, Huey," the colonel told him one day. "But let's be real. You don't have any money. My daughter can't marry someone who's broke. Come back and talk to me when you've got 10,000 pounds. 10,000 pounds. Huey didn't even have 10 pounds to his name. His aunt gave him a little bit of money every week, 4 or 5 pounds, but that was barely enough to get by. Right now, Huey had just 1 pound in his pocket. Things were looking pretty grim. Huey's best friend was a guy named Alan Trevor, who was an artist. And not just any artist. He was a really good and famous one. Rich people paid him a lot of money to paint their portraits. His studio was always busy with wealthy clients coming in to have their pictures done. One day, Huey went to visit Alan at his studio. When he walked in, Alan was in the middle of working on a new painting. "So, what do you think of this?" Alan asked, pointing at the painting. "And what about my model?" Huey looked at the canvas. It was a portrait of an old beggar. The model, a real person standing off to the side, was an elderly man wearing ragged, torn clothes. His face looked so sad it could break your heart. In one hand, he was holding out a hat, like he was begging for money, and in the other hand, he had a stick to help him stand. "My model is amazing, isn't he?" Alan said proudly. "Have you ever seen such a perfect beggar?" "Poor guy," Huey said as he looked at the old man. "He looks so sad." "Of course he does," Alan replied. "I'm painting a beggar. I don't want him to look cheerful." Huey, curious as always, asked, "How much do you pay a model for standing around here all day?" "Not much," Alan said casually. "Just a shilling an hour." "And how much are you selling this painting for?" Huey pressed. "This one? 2,000 pounds, Alan said with a smirk. "Wow, you're raking it in," Huey exclaimed. "You should share some of that with the model." "Don't be ridiculous," Alan shot back. "It's hard work being a painter. Being a beggar, not so much. Pretty much anyone can hold out a hat and look sad. Very few people can paint like I can." "Sure, but lots of people dream of being rich, famous painters," Huey argued. "Nobody wants to be a poor old beggar. That's just cruel." Alan laughed. "All right, enough of your chatter. Sit down and stop distracting me. I'm busy." Just then, a servant walked in and announced, "A gentleman is here, sir. He'd like you to paint his portrait. Can you see him?" "Don't move," Alan said to Huey as he got up. I'll be back in a moment." As Alan left, the old beggar eased himself into a chair, still holding his hat. He looked so pitiful that Huey couldn't help but feel sorry for him. Huey reached into his pocket and found a single £1. It was the last of his money, but he thought, well, he needs it more than I do. Without a word, Huey walked over and dropped the £1 into the man's hat. The beggar looked up, startled, then smiled warmly. "Thank you, sir," he said. "Thank you very much." When Alan returned, Huey said goodbye and left to visit Laura. He told her the whole story about the beggar. "You gave away your last £1?" Laura asked, half scolding, half admiring. "That was foolish. My father will never let me marry someone so reckless. But you're also incredibly kind, and I love you for that." Later that night, Huey ran into Alan at a club. Alan looked particularly pleased with himself. "I finished that painting today," Alan said with a grin. "And you know what? My model was really curious about you. He kept asking me all sorts of questions. About me? Poor old guy. I wish I could do something for him," Huey said thoughtfully. "What did he want to know?" "Everything," Alan said. "I told him all about you, about Laura, her father, and how you want to marry her but don't have any money." Huey was surprised. "You told him all that?" "Every detail," Alan replied with a mischievous glint in his eye. "Alan!" Huey snapped, clearly upset. "You told him all my personal business? Seriously?" "Calm down," Alan said, waving off Huey's anger. "You don't even know who I was painting that picture for. It was for Baron von Hausberg. You know, one of the richest men in Europe. That old beggar was the Baron himself, dressed up for the painting." Huey's jaw dropped. "Wait, what? Are you telling me that the beggar was actually Baron von Hausberg?" "Exactly," Alan confirmed with a grin. Huey put his head in his hands. "Oh no, I gave him £1. Now I feel like a total idiot." Alan burst into laughter. "You gave him £1? That's the funniest thing I've ever heard." He couldn't stop laughing, which only made Huey feel worse. Huey walked home, completely embarrassed. He'd just given his last £1 to a literal millionaire. What would Laura's father say if he found out? There was no way the colonel would let his daughter marry someone so clueless. The next day, there was a knock at Huey's door. A man he didn't recognize was standing there. Can I help you?" Huey asked. "I'm here on behalf of Baron von Hausberg," the man said politely. Huey's stomach dropped. "The Baron? Oh no. Look, I didn't realize who he was yesterday, and I'm really sorry if I was rude to him." The man smiled warmly. "You weren't rude at all. In fact, the Baron asked me to give you this." He handed Huey an envelope. Huey thanked him, still confused, and looked down at the envelope. Written on the front were the words, "A wedding present to Huey Erskine and Laura Merton from an old beggar." Heart pounding, Huey opened the envelope. Inside was a check for £10,000.